I'm Jane Sasseen, and I am the Executive Director of the McGraw Center for Business Journalism here at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. And we are so delighted to have Ron and Margie and Robin join us today to talk about their amazing award-winning series on the human rights and labor abuses in the palm oil industry. As many of you may or may not know, the McGraw Center, one of the main things we do here is we fund and provide editorial support for investigative projects and enterprise stories involving critical business and economic issues. And this was one of our earlier projects. I think we funded, it was a long project. They worked on this for, I think, 2 years. So we funded it a couple of years ago, and we're just incredibly proud of the work you've done. So let me just introduce them briefly, and then we'll get into questions. So first, we have Margie Mason, and she's been a reporter for the AP for more than 20 countries across 4 continents. She was based in Southeast Asia for nearly 2 decades, including as the bureau chief in Indonesia. It was, I think, her last posting there. She was also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and an Asian Studies Fellow at the University of Hawaii, and she's now back in West Virginia. And then Robin McDowell, who also spent most of her career working in Southeast Asia, where she covered everything from bloody coups and terrorist attacks to plane crashes, tsunamis, and the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims. She's now based in Minnesota, from where she continues to also focus her reporting to continue to work on many of the world's most vulnerable. In 2016, Margie and Robin were both part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for their earlier series of stories called Seafood from Slaves, which those stories focused on something like 2,000 enslaved migrant workers who were being held on fishing boats in Asia, and the stories helped them free them and led to the arrests and convictions of some of the people responsible. And then we have Ron Nixon, who is the head of global investigations for the Associated Press, where he oversees the agency's entire investigative unit. Before joining the AP, he was a Washington correspondent for the New York Times, and he also reported from Rwanda, Uganda, South Africa, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ron received the inaugural 2021 News Leader of the Year award from the News Leaders Association this past year, and he was also honored as the keynote speaker at last year's Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference. So welcome to all of you. And what I wanted to do first is just talk for a few minutes with Ron about kind of the general challenges and kind of the environment for investigative reporting at this point. And Ron, I wanted to have you, if you could talk a little bit and elaborate a little bit of, I was fortunate I was at IRE and heard the very powerful speech that you gave there, talking about some of the issues that investigative journalism faces and just the overall in the climate we face in the news business of a lot of mistrust, a lot of disinformation, a lot of skepticism about, particularly, the kinds of, criticisms of the mainstream press that, places like the AP does. And you talked a lot about the importance of the role of investigative journalism in combating that. So right. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? What your
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having all of us here. It's an honor to speak and speak before all of you. And I hope that people will leave this with some great lessons from Robin and Margie. So first of all, the climate that we operate in is not like the one that Watergate exists with the Washington Post and the historic, not the historic, but the heroic, duo of Woodward and Bernstein taking on, all the Nixon White House folks and helping to expose what the Watergate break-in meant, which ultimately helped lead to Richard Nixon's resignation as president, which a lot of us, I was 6 at the time, but still that was a huge influence on a lot of us who got into reporting. And, there's a movie and there were books, and journalism schools, I think, saw a bump in people wanting to be journalists. And so it was sort of, glory days, so to speak. Uh, the environment that we find ourselves in now is vastly different from that. So there's some bad things and there's some good things. So first, the bad things. The bad things are the things that you mentioned: the disinformation, the misinformation, the distrust of the press, the sort of political tribalism that we have, where people will just dismiss something and it will have not even read it. I mean, because it was in the New York Times or the AP, they don't believe it. They didn't read it. They just don't believe it just because it's in those publications, and we did it. So we faced that kind of thing. We also faced a climate in which, the news media has taken a beating and newspapers have gone out of business. A lot of people have pulled back from doing investigations because it's expensive, it's time consuming. There's also, when you write about powerful people and corporations, there's a chance that they may come after you legally. So that's the climate that we find ourselves in now. And again, it's challenging, but I will say that even with all of those challenging, I see that investigative reporting is probably more widespread than it ever has been, because there's so many more outlets that exist now that didn't exist when I was coming up, like ProPublica. Like, I couldn't even pronounce it when it first came out, and now it's like a mainstay. BuzzFeeds and all the nonprofits that are part of like the Institute for Nonprofit News, the INN, and Center for Public Integrity has been around forever. Reveal, which was the first, the organization that runs Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, which is one of the reasons that I got into journalism, by reading their publication Circle of Poison, and how poisons that were not allowed here in the US were allowed in other places, and then the food that those pesticides were used on came back to the US. So that was a big influence on me. And by the way, they didn't hire me when I applied for a job, so I always remind them of that. But to get back to my point, there's a lot more investigative journalism going on now with those organizations that I mentioned, and also like local news organizations. The Charleston Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina is doing phenomenal work. The Tampa Bay Times has always done phenomenal work. My old newspaper, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, among others, are doing phenomenal work out there. So all is not lost. There's still a lot going on.
And in terms of, particularly countering some of the negative trends that you talked about initially, how important is the role of the investigative teams and the investigative stories that are done, just the role of investigative journalism in countering those challenges?
I think it's critical to have investigative reporting, because in the absence of someone shining a light on wrongdoing, it festers, and so that's been our role. And the fewer of us doing that, the more you see things go unchallenged. You see corruption and all sorts of other malfeasance that happens. So take the recent Tampa Bay Times investigation into a lead smelter in that community, where people are exposed to inordinate amounts of lead that, there's no safe amount of lead that a human being could be exposed to. But the federal government, the regulators, did nothing until they exposed the dangers that were happening there. And all of a sudden there's proposed fines and there's inspections and all of those things that are now happening. You go back a few years and look at the New York Times and their investigation of Harvey Weinstein, powerful producer in Hollywood who gave money to a lot of political causes, including Democratic causes. And he is in jail now. The same with Jeffrey Epstein with the Miami Herald. Right? So imagine a world in which there were no investigative reporters. Those people would still be running around, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of the the proudest moments in my career as a journalist was working with Robin and Margie on the investigation that was done in Minnesota about the case of a young man who was in prison for life at the age of 16. And they did the story in January of 2020, and in December of 2020, he walked out of prison. That was more rewarding than any award that I've ever won. And outside of the birth of my children, probably one of the proudest moments that I've ever had as an adult. So he would likely still be in prison had it not for that. So this is why we do what we do, not because of awards or monetary compensation, although those things are important. I'm not going to sit here and lie like we don't do it for free.
Although if any of us were in this for monetary compensation, this would not be the profession we'd have chosen.
True, right. But we do not do it for free, and people should be compensated for the work that they do.
Yeah.
But that's the critical role that investigative reporting plays. And if we weren't here, a lot of those things would likely still be going on. And so you just, whenever I get not disillusioned, but more sort of question like, oh, why am I doing this? That's what brings me back to.
That's why.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And can you also, I want to have you talk a little bit about, you spoke also some of the other challenges, one of them being particularly the composition of teams, and that there are not enough journalists of color still doing investigative work. And you helped co-found the Ida B. Wells Society. You talked about you've been able to bring more journalists of color into your own investigations team at AP. Can you talk about the importance of that, so why that's obviously been critical to you, but how does that change how you guys choose your stories, think about the stories, the coverage that gets done? Talk about, kind of why that matters.
So diversity matters for a number of reasons. And so I'll talk broadly about diversity, and then I'll talk more specifically about diversity. So diversity matters in that, if you have people with the same viewpoint, sort of the same backgrounds, you get sort of the same types of stories. But when you expand the playing field and you bring in more people with different lived experiences, it changes how you cover things. Now, that a lot of the diversity effort, we talk about racial diversity, and that's obviously something that I've tried to improve on here. One of the reasons that we founded the Ida B. Wells Society. And again, those people of color bring different life experiences and viewpoints to the field. But the biggest thing about that is that I want the best people. And so when you expand the field, you get lots and lots of people to choose from. And that's the biggest thing about it. Like, you can't just look at a narrow group of people and everybody try to pick from those people, because you may be missing some of the best candidates out there. Someone gave me an opportunity to do this type of work. And so, expanding the field is the biggest thing around diversity, because you're missing so many great young people out there who may end up doing great work because they're not thought of as what you look for in an investigative reporter. And, I look for people who don't necessarily check all the boxes, because I didn't check all the boxes when I first started doing this type of work. So, but I look for people who are hungry, who have drive, who have ambition. Those are things I can't teach you. I can teach you other things. I can teach you how to write. I can teach you how to find documents and things like that. But the ability to be just relentless, like, if I were somebody and Robin and Margie called me, I would be very worried. Because I know that they are going to just be relentless, and whatever it is that I'm doing, they're going to find out about it. So that's the type of thing that I can't teach you to be. That has to come from within. But the other things that I can teach, and just briefly, let me add in diversity, other types of diversity. I am a Black man, but I'm also from rural Mississippi. I am from a community of 462 people. I'm sorry, 464. We picked up 4 people in the census. So we had some growth. But that brings a different perspective to this, right? I'm not from New York. I'm not from DC. I'm not even from a city. We have a census designated place. I'm also a veteran of the Marine Corps. So those were all of the experiences. I hired a fellow veteran. One of my first hires was hiring a fellow veteran who brings a different viewpoint. So when we think about diversity, we have to think about all of these things, because all of these people really help us have a more enriched experience when it comes to investigative reporting.
I imagine they bring very different story ideas and approaches to stories. It's stories that other people with more traditional backgrounds just simply won't see.
Right, and I also think it helps to shoot down some ridiculous things too that might come up as a story idea. Margie and I have to talk about being from rural areas and what people think about us, from people who are from like rural areas. And some of the stuff is ridiculous, right? Like you think, like we have electricity, we wear shoes, we have water in our house and stuff like that. We have the internet, or like my mom used to say, we use the Google, so. Google, you have to preference it with Google. So, but it helps to like bring that perspective, like, look, there are other parts of this country that we don't think about. And I'm not talking about like just the bias of like, people live in a bubble, because truthfully, everybody lives in a bubble. You live in your bubble, right? But that being from those things like, for instance, when I see stuff about guns, right? I grew up around guns all my life. Like if you didn't have a gun in your house, something was wrong, right? So I have no issues with covering it, because I was around it. It's not foreign to me, and you can help sort of guide people to not think stereotypically about things that they're covering that they may not have any experience with. And so when I worked at the Roanoke Times, and I would go and cover, coal mining and folks in the Appalachian region, I mean, this was like home, because this is what I knew. So it wasn't like a stretch to go talk to people and sit on the perch, as we would say, and drink sweet tea with that much sugar in it, so this is all stuff that I grew up with, so it wasn't foreign to me.
Okay, that's great. Well, why don't that's kind of a good transition into talking with Margie and Robin a little bit.
Sure.
And as we talked about earlier, and you mentioned one of their other stories that on a completely different subject from the human rights abuses in global global industries in Asia and whatnot. You have this amazing track record, both of you, I'm going to talk about you collectively, because everything I've seen, you seem to be working on together, although I know you've done a lot of stories on your own as well, I'm sure, or separately. But, you've done lots of stories, hugely successful on very different areas. So I'd like to maybe to start with, if you could talk a little about how you think about, how you come up with your stories, kind of a little generally, and then specifically with the palm oil series, what made you guys launch into this and think that, palm oil as a subject, and that obviously that this particular angle made sense to devote a year or more of your life to? Who wants to take that? You want to start, Margie?
This is usually Robin's territory, but I guess she wants me to do it. So I mean, I think, we both have a strong interest in kind of human rights abuses, human rights issues, social justice issues. For a long time, I was a medical writer in Asia. And so I was, really focusing on a lot of issues dealing with, poverty is always kind of there, women and children. and, you know, minorities, persecuted minorities, and these are all kind of interests that Robin and I share. And over the years, you know, I think we were both in Southeast Asia. We were kind of isolated I was for a long time in Vietnam, and she was in Indonesia. And, you know, we were women, and we were trying to kind of figure out what we were doing. And I think we just kind of, you know, I started coming and doing a lot of stories inside Indonesia, and we clicked, and we became, you know, we were colleagues, we became friends, we, you know, really started to kind of lean on each other. And, you know, I would say, I mean, over the past 15 years, even if, you know, her name wasn't there, or my name wasn't there, we were reading each other's stuff, we were commenting, we were helping to guide each other. And, you know, and then I think that just kind of, you know, we worked on a lot of stuff together, and then we started doing bigger stuff. And it got to the place to where some of the ideas that we had, we were both really interested in them, and they were too big for one of us to take on alone. And so we really started then launching into these bigger projects. But I think with the palm oil, and also, you know, with seafood from slaves, both of those things, we often say, you know, having spent so much time in an area, you know, and really getting to know different topics, that's where the richest stories come from. And that's where you also kind of see what's been done and what hasn't been done. And I think that's kind of really where this palm oil story came from. It was just really us having been there and worked there and doing different things that were intersecting. You know, we had both been working a lot on you mentioned earlier, the Rohingya, you know, this persecuted Muslim minority in Burma. And, you know, from that was really kind of, you know, where this palm oil idea really kind of started to come from.
Okay, and talk a little bit. So again, one of the things that stands out, you know, in all there's 3 stories in the palm oil series. You've got incredibly strong and powerful, you know, characters. The people you're talking to, you're able to, you know, locate people, and, you know, as you say, a lot of them were, you know, they were in terrible situations, very marginalized, you know, in fear because of their job situation and their life situation. Talk first a little bit both about how you find people. You're there, you know, it's obviously a complex situation. You know, these palm oil plantations are not easy to get onto. How do you develop and find the sources that you talk to? Robin,
well, I can start. Yeah, I'll start on that, and then I'll hand it over to Margie, because she was really on the ground for the entire time on this project. So did most of those really, really tough interviews. And like Margie said, growing up in these areas are not, we feel like we grew up in Asia, but
professionally, maybe.
Professionally, yeah. Palm oil is something that you cannot escape. I mean, it is like an ocean. When you're on an airplane, it's all you can see. And it's really hard to get around. The various companies, it's just a patchwork, and different companies owning, you know, huge swaths of palm oil, and often gated or guarded, you know, guard posts to get in, and then having to drive on a, you know, in a car for another hour to get to the housing areas. And so it really is something that it feels like it's something you cannot escape because it's everywhere. But really, these people were as isolated as the men on the boats when we did the fishing story. I mean, it is pretty much the same thing. So that's one of the reasons the story took as long as it did. They're very vulnerable. It's easy for the owners of the companies or the managers to identify who you're talking to based on little things like a number on a tree or a motorcycle license plate, or even the clothing or their voices. So the goal really was to protect the workers and to speak to as many as possible. And that was really, really a time-consuming and delicate
Yeah.
operation.
Yeah. And
And-
actually if you could talk a little bit about that, because again, yes, as you say, they're very vulnerable people at great risk. How do you talk with them or work with them to build, or I imagine you've got to build a lot of trust in order for them to talk with you. Can you, talk about how you do that? How do you go about engaging them in that way?
Marge?
Well, I mean, I think that, one of the things that's really important is to kind of, we took our time and
Yeah.
we developed really good sources on the ground. So, we had, fixers, and we had people who were in the know, who were trusted. And we made it very clear what we were doing. And we also made it very clear about how we were going to do it and how they saw how careful we were being. And, I think a lot of times, people, they may, these are people who may not even have access to, the phones may not work, let alone internet. So they don't know what the AP is or how this could impact them. And so, they might not necessarily be worried or have any concerns talking to us. But one of the things that we tried to do was, there were times when it was deemed okay. I went in and talked, or Robin went in to the plantations. But then there were also times when we spent a lot of time planning and kind of really carefully kind of choreographing the trip. And, okay, we're gonna, get these people to come out. They're going to take motorbikes, or we're going to meet them. We had some interviews in, cafes that were like a town over, or, sometimes we would come into hotels and we would kind of, sneak them in. I remember, doing this crazy thing where, we had some Rohingya workers and they were working not too far away in Malaysia. And so we kind of, we kind of snuck them in, and then, I came in separately because, it was like, we knew that I was going to, there would be a lot of attention. And so I just came in kind of almost as a separate, traveler. And then we met, and there were just a lot of things like that we thought about how to minimize, like, let's not try to draw as little attention as possible, because, when the stories come out, they might try to then figure out who was talking. So, like, we didn't identify specific plantations. We didn't identify specific areas that we were in, even our date lines. I mean, I know that, like, we just used Sumatra as a date line. I mean, Sumatra it's a massive island, or I think we said like peninsular Malaysia at one point, because we just did not want to have anything that anybody could use to pinpoint. And that takes a lot of thought.
Yeah, it seems like, I think you told me the other day an example also when I think it was you needed to get snuck onto a plantation, because I would assume in most cases the plantations didn't want you to be there, and so you had to get in surreptitiously. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you organized that, and also not only how you talked about protecting your sources, but you all were putting yourselves at risk too. So how did you kind of incorporate that into your reporting to do it as safely for yourselves as well?
Yeah, there was a lot of, we tried the best that we could to not, set off a lot of alarms, but I know that at least in one particular case, we were being followed by plainclothes police. At one point we were working like 3 hours away in this really remote area. And when we got back to the hotel, I was, called downstairs by the front desk, and they said, we need to see your passport. We need to see your visa. We need to see your quitas or your work permit. And I said, well, I checked in yesterday. Why didn't you need it then? Well, the police have called. They're looking for you. And so, fortunately, everything was in order. But I mean, we cut the trip. We decided just to cut the trip short because, again, we didn't want to be drawing any extra attention to us, and more so than anything, to the people on the ground helping us, or the people who were talking to us. We worked, and we had like a network set up so that, like the person who was at the guard at the gate, he knew and to let us in. I mean, it was like a whole we would set up everything so that nobody was going to be in a position to stop us and try to, ask a lot of questions. One time I remember I was like, they put me on the floor of the car and like I had a scarf over me and, so.
This was to drive into one of the plantations so that they wouldn't see you?
We were going to meet somebody, but that we just didn't want, we were trying to just, keep it as low as possible. So yeah, you do lots of different things, but the planning really was key, I think. And maybe we went overboard. I don't know, but I would rather go too far than not far enough.
Yeah. Well, if you can actually talk a little bit about that, because what kinds of things were you planning out? And Ron, if you want to participate in this or answer this too. So there, I think actually at that point, only one of you was in Indonesia. I don't think you were both there at the same time. One of you is in the United States. You have editors, Ron and the other editors that were working with the story. And how do you coordinate all that? And Ron, from your perspective, you're watching them do this stuff that you want to make sure they're safe and your reporters and their subjects are not in trouble. So how do you talk a little bit about that process and how do you do that and make sure that, in the end, it does work out. You all come back and you have a good story and you're all safe.
Oh, well, from my perspective, I came in probably in the middle of this. So this was maybe a year in, Margie, Robin, that you're reporting. And so the first thing for me was just getting up to speed as to what, and also like, they didn't even know me. So I just had to sort of introduce myself to them. And, I would stay up so I could talk to Margie because the time difference. I flew to Minneapolis to talk to Robin. And I just tried to get a sense of what was going on, what was already in play, and also what resources that they needed. So Margie was saying, hey, can we get this drone footage? And I said, sure. And could we get this thing, or could we get a person to go here or hire somebody to do this? And, so my job was kind of being the air traffic controller here and just making sure that they had the resources and the time that they needed. So someone else wasn't, saying, hey, can they help with this thing or that thing? It was like hands off because this is what they're working on now, and then coordinating with the editor who did the bulk of the line editing, Kristen Gasley, just talk through what she was hoping to do once she got looking at timing, thinking about when we could publish, and dealing with some other internal pressures as well. Oh, yeah, right.
I'm not even going to go there, but I want to bring you back, Margie, to the planning question also in terms of the reporting, because again, one of the things that struck me in the series is in each of the pieces, you do a really interesting comparison where in the piece that was about the violence that women put up with and suffer there, and in the first piece, you tied, the palm oil to the products that we use, the Girl Scout cookies and, beauty products and food and whatnot. So in, the piece with, the women, you brought, a $30, I think it was, lipstick, kind of a typical thing that, we would see here, and brought it to one of the women or girls who was working in the field, and, her reaction as to how much work she would have to do to be able to buy that. And then I think in one of the other pieces, there was an example of palm oil that goes to make ice cream. And you talked, I think it was a young boy, and he had never eaten ice cream. And then, of course, in the final story, the link between palm oil going into Girl Scout cookies, and you have this incredible parallel between, I forget whether they were 11 or 12 years old, a girl who's working in the palm oil fields who's had to leave school, and this Girl Scout in America who's realizing there's this connection and trying to eliminate it. How much of that was just serendipitous in the reporting versus did you go into it looking for those kinds of examples and thinking about, talk a little bit about how you strategize or plan to get those kinds of details, because those are some of the things that really make the stories come alive at a very visceral and very human level.
You want to take this
What do you
one?
want to say?
All right, I'll take this one. Well, I think one thing is when you talk to 120, 30 people, workers, your chances of serendipity happening improve greatly,
Yeah.
right?
Luck is what comes out. What is the cliche, luck and hard work are tied some, whatever it is. Yeah.
And I think there was just so much reporting and research and talking things through from different perspectives and trying to achieve a lot of different things in these three stories. I mean, this is a $65 billion industry.
Mm-hmm.
Palm oil, it can be found in pretty much everything. You cannot escape it in the course of the day, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep. In pesticides, pills, all those things. So we wanted to kind of show that, but also show who's financing this and how, how is this industry being allowed to continue to grow at basically, if you're looking at a graph, the line goes straight up forever, pretty much. And also these sustainability stamps of approval. We looked into that, and that seemed to be completely, bogus, basically. No one was really monitoring that. And if they were, it was for environmental reasons, not, and they can tell that a forest isn't being burnt down by using satellite. That's not really that hard anymore, but they weren't talking to workers. That was not something that was, that was in, that they were thinking about even. So I think it's really we had different ideas we wanted to get into each of the stories. And because Margie spoke to so many workers, we could find people to illustrate, really in ways that even surprised us. Like, we were not looking for a girl in Indonesia who was working on a palm oil plantation that fed into Girl Scout cookies. And there happened to be a girl who was fighting about this stamp of approval partially, and also the destruction of the rainforests and the killing of orangutans. She's been doing that for years. And she was a Girl Scout who was, it was one of those things that we wouldn't have looked for. It would have been insane to look for that. But your intent is always up, and you're always thinking, and I think that's true for all of them, really. I mean, Jum, who was the main character in the trafficking story, was also someone that Margie found on last trip in. So we had a whole other plan for that story, leading with Rohingya and people, which was our original idea for the series, was kind of to use the Rohingya as a way to show, here the most vulnerable people on the planet are being used to harvest palm oil that ends up in, everything, and the banks are financing it, and they're being trapped, so it was a very compelling way into the story, but really Jum was someone who we think better illustrated the issue, because most of the workers were Indonesian, and there were just so many things. Also, that story looked heavily at the banks and the financing, and we were able to find out, that his money that was being deducted from his paycheck, so it was all kind of, again, being flexible and fluid in deciding.
Well, it sounds like, and I think you said something the other day about, you can do all this enormous amount of planning, but then you actually have to follow, and the stories evolve based on where the reporting takes you, and kind of being open to, we got all this done, but the reporting's taking us here, and that's where we need to go.
Exactly.
Yeah. And is that, Ron, if maybe, I don't know if you can comment on that from kind of an editor's perspective, and kind of how you, again, dealing with them, and this is at this point, you're 18 months into the project. You've got outlines for 3 different stories, and one of them, I think at that point, almost written. And it's like, we found this other great person. We want to, scrap that and do kind of a whole new structure for the stories. How'd that work out? How'd that happen?
Well, it worked out well, but I think, I remember the email from Margie. I think I got it at night or something, but my response was like, well, if it makes the story better, then that's fine, because again, it's my job to keep things away from them so they can get their work done. But really, we emphasize storytelling with the investigations that we do, and anything that made the story better. And I know I speak for Kristen as well, that we were fine with that, even if it took a little bit more time.
And just for the people who don't know, Kristen was their direct line editor, and I'm sure it wasn't because of this story, but she retired I guess a little bit ago now, a few months after the story came out. So I'm sure it wasn't because of this project, but
No.
but that is actually an interesting lead into my next question, because I want to ask you about the thing. Everyone who works on these kind of large stories with, tons of reporting, you've talked to, as you say, like hundreds of people, you've got all this data on the banks and the companies, you've been working for whatever, 18 months. How do you organize all this? First of all, talk about, kind of as you're going along, how you organize your reporting and your interviews. And then once you sit down to write, kind of how, again, there's a lot of people listening to this who are fairly young into their career, early into their journalism careers, want to do big projects, but it's intimidating to everybody. So talk a little bit about how you organize things. And
Well, if I could jump in just for a quick
absolutely.
second. I think one of the things, and I hopefully Margie and Robin will agree with me, is not a lot of stuff is given to conceptual editing, and that is thinking through the thing before you actually write it. And so I know that we spent time talking about all the stuff and then they were telling me that we could go this way, we could go that way, but ultimately through all of that, it came down to these three main areas that they could focus on. But, talking it through, I think, hopefully it helped, and I didn't really like burden them with any additional thing. But it's a understated part of this that Kristen did, and then Kristen and I would talk about it as well. But that is a process that for folks out there, if you have an editor, I would always suggest you sit down and talk through the things before you actually start, sitting down at the computer and start typing.
Yeah. Before I do want both of you to answer that question too, but I just want to say to the audience, this is about going to go into, some time for questions from you all. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it into the chat and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Well, we have time. So please go ahead and start putting those in. So, okay, Robin or Margie, you want to take on from each of your perspectives, how you approach the organization and writing?
Well, I mean, I think we're a little unorthodox in the way that we work, because we kind of share a brain in a way. And so we talk a lot, we talk through things a lot, we strategize a lot. I mean, everything, you were talking about the various elements in the stories with the lipstick and the ice cream and all of these different things. I mean, like all of the details and all of the things that are in there, like nothing is in there by chance. Like we really, really, like every detail is discussed, and to the point we're gonna, the editor's gonna kill us. And Kristen was phenomenal in working with us on this. But I mean, I think like just in terms of organization, if I go into the field and do a lot of interviews on a big project, I will typically kind of, write stuff. Like I'll just write a bunch of stuff. And often the first draft of the story, I call it stream of consciousness. It's just, I just sit down and literally, if I'm feeling it and it's there, then I just throw some stuff down. And, it's often super rough and kind of all over the place, but it's something that we can build from. And you're
doing that as you're doing your interviews, kind of while the impression is fresh.
Yeah, I mean, like I'll usually, like if it's a long day in the field, I'll that night maybe, or if it's a week-long reporting trip in the field and I'm exhausted, I might do it when I get back. But I will typically do that. And then we outline a lot.
Mhm.
I think it's really important if you have a lot of material and you have a lot to talk about, you need to kind of have your buckets and organize that way. And then like Ron said, I think, a lot of times you see these investigative projects and they're really phenomenal. The reporting is phenomenal, but they're dense. They're hard to read because it might just be a bunch of data or a bunch of records, and maybe there's like one anecdote or something. But I think like for us, we really try to put as much emphasis on the writing as we do on the reporting.
Mhm.
And that is like, it's kind of double the work, right? I mean, oftentimes the writing is way harder than the reporting.
Yeah.
But I think if you can work with an editor who shares that vision and really try to just keep polishing and keep, that's the way that we do it.
Yeah.
And we've been very fortunate because we've always had really good editors who do this with us and talk. We talk a lot to the editor.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, one of the questions is, so how do you do that? How do you get your editor to sit down, on the Zoom or wherever and talk it out? This person says they're editor, but I'm sure there are other editors that, I'm busy, or I'm not going to write your story for you. Do you have any advice on how to kind of, bring the editor in, and I guess, Ron, from your perspective as an editor, I'm sure there is a difference between I'm going to help and we're going to work on this together versus feeling like, oh my God, like I just, I've got to write the person's story for them, which may not be obviously what that person said, but.
No, this
anyway.
was like, again, talking through the story as the reporting is going on. And also once you get that first draft, realizing that that's just it's a draft. And making sure all the elements are there, and then looking for things that, well, okay, maybe it should add a little bit more of this, maybe you should have less of that. Maybe we need a stronger nut graph, maybe something needs to be moved higher. But again, engaging the editor, so you're not getting the sort of final draft and then wondering, okay, what happened to what we talked about before?
Mhm.
Is important to just keep that communication going, because again, you want to make sure that you as an editor understand it too, because the worst thing you can do is get something get something when it's final and you have no idea what it is. So you go back and you ask a bunch of stupid questions that the reporters are going like, oh my God, did you like read this? So I think all of those things are critical when you're trying to oversee something of this size and complexity.
And in terms of how we get the editor's attention, Ron, it's kind of like, like the intensity. It's like, if we want him, even though he's super busy, it's like, I think he's kind of like, okay, I have to deal with them, or like something's going to catch on fire very soon.
Yeah. It's good motivation on both sides, I'm sure.
I would say because I have an interest in this, what they're working on, and I'm always just like fascinated by the topics, so always happy to listen.
Yeah. One question that's somewhat related is, other than gusto and drive, how did you all convince editors that you had the chops, so to speak? This person says, they've got 7 years of experience and a portfolio, but are still having trouble convincing editors that they can do this. And, and maybe it's kind of related to just a broader question I was going to ask you all as well too, which is, what do you have other advice, specific advice for, again, younger journalists who want to do more investigative work, who need to, build up their portfolios or demonstrate that they can do it? Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the kinds of things people can do? Are there particular skills they should learn or strategies they should take in terms of developing their stories and approaching editors?
You know, the advice that I always give people, there's two things. One is, you know, you're not just going to basically be given, you know, whatever you need, a year or 2 years to do this kind of reporting, especially if you've never done it before. But that doesn't mean that you can't be working on investigative stories on the side. You know, Robin and I, we were doing a lot of things. We were dealing with, you know, the Rohingya, there was ethnic cleansing going on. We dealt with plane crashes. We dealt with, you know, earthquakes, tsunamis, you know, we're AP. So we're always turning, and we're, you know, in really large, important countries at the time. But we always had our side projects. And, you know, we didn't always, the other thing I always say, you don't always have to tell your editor everything you're doing. So like, you know, you can have these little projects, and maybe if you were talking to the editor, he or she would say, oh, you know, don't waste your time with this. You're busy with this other thing. But if they don't know you're doing this other side thing, and then you happen to get something really good, and then you go to them, chances are at that point, they're going to give you the time and the resources that you need to actually do it. So, I mean, I think like, you know, we do like, before we do a pitch, we've done so much pre-reporting that we pretty much know, you know, our pitches are pretty much nailed down to what we're going to do. And I think that that's not a lot of people sometimes do that. They might pitch something thinking that it's there, or they might have just one thing, a source or one document or something. And I think that having a more robust kind of pre-reporting and pitch together, you know, that's also going to help to, you know, get an editor interested.
Yeah. Okay. Ron, did you have anything more you wanted to add to that?
No.
Robin?
Yeah, I guess another part of it is just kind of as you're doing your regular reporting, your day-to-day stuff, you know, things that you want to get to later. You kind of just have this list that builds and builds. And as you're, you know, maybe it's 5 years later, Margie and I have certainly done this, where we come back, we've talked about something years ago, and then something new happens that makes you realize, oh, this is our chance to blow this up and make this into a bigger story.
Yeah. And do you keep that list kind of ongoing, and just you're constantly adding to it as you see little tidbits that don't work with the story you're working on?
Yeah, well, and when with us, because we talk about so many things, we don't have a list on the wall or anything. It's just, we have topics that we have an interest in, and then we might even go down that road for a while and start doing some reporting, and then it's really just not there, or we get distracted by some other shiny object. But it never disappears. And sometimes, you know, if you give it a little time, it actually turns into something much better than if you had done it at that moment. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question from for freelancers. Do you have any suggested strategies for freelancers who are not connected to a newsroom for, could be a myriad of reasons. It might be a news desert, the lack of resources in local newsrooms, or the local newsrooms are not doing investigative work. So suggestions for freelancers who want to be able to do this kind of work. And is it searching for grants, for example, which we do, by the way, whoever that person is, we and many of the grant making organizations that support this kind of work do support freelancers as well as people are on staff. But just more broadly, do you have any suggestions for freelancers who want to do these kinds of projects?
Well, I'll jump in. First thing is I would really, make sure you do the research on the people that you're pitching the stories to that they're interested and that they use freelancers, because I get pitches from freelancers like all the time, and we have a team of almost 30 people, so I don't really use a lot of freelancers. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, making sure that, you have the funding to be able to do it, which are like institutions like yourself, or the Fund for Investigative Journalism, FIJ, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. There's a number of groups out there that provide funding for freelancers. There's also an association for freelancers that provides resources called FIRE. I think it's called.
Yeah, it is. It's freelance investigative reporters and editors.
Right. So, and that's some resources that I would suggest that people look into. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, which this is good. I had actually wanted to talk about this earlier. Could we hear about how they work together as a team in terms of your reporting strategy and approach, and also about the kinds of stories that make best use of your being a team? Yeah. So talk a little bit about how you work together and, as a team.
Well, I think it gets back to what we were talking about a little earlier, and that is we talk a lot, and we're kind of sharing ideas, bouncing things back and forth. I think one of the reasons we work together so well, or we're so comfortable, is we really trust each other. We trust each other's opinion, instincts, and just kind of that we have each other's backs. And that's kind of the most important thing, really, because it's easy to think, oh, someone's going to steal this idea, or they're not going to see that, its value, and kind of poo-poo it or whatever. And that can be demoralizing. But I think when we know we have something good, we both know it instantly. And often it's just one of us saying like one word of the magic thing, that this is the missing ingredient. The seafood from slaves was a really good example of that, because we knew there were abuses in the fishing industry, and people had written about it, about people who had escaped, and told about what they had endured on the boats. And one day Margie called, and we didn't want to do the same story. We knew that the things that have been written weren't really resonating or making real significant change. And Margie called one day and said, I know, what if we connect this to the American dinner table? So that people are doing a lot of supply chain tracking, but that was really one that without that, I don't think anyone would have cared about that story, really. I mean, it certainly would not have led to changes in laws, or the freeing of those men.
Right.
Yeah.
And to piggyback off that same conversation, so I came back from an interview and I said that, and then I think in that same conversation, she said, we got to find men who are still, being held captive.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, it was like, that's how it works with us. And so we're obviously working together in concert, but we're working on a project right now, and she's kind of been in one area, and I know everything that she's doing, and I'm helping her with it, but I've been doing stuff in another area. And so, we're always aware, we're always talking, but we're also kind of, we realize that we need to be kind of throwing the net out as far as we can, and, using, we have a lot of the same skills, but we also have different skills. And I think that, you kind of take whatever that is and you harness it to get, as much as you can on whatever it is that you're looking at. And, I think that it's the brainstorming, the talking, trying to turn things upside down and looking at it. I mean, that's what we did with palm oil too, right? I mean, everything had looked at the environment for the most part. No one had really done a deep dive. Even organizations. I mean, nobody had really looked at the women. And that was something right away that I identified. And I said, I want to look at this and see what's happening with this. And, we were telling, people who've worked in this area things, and they didn't know.
Which I think is a really interesting and really valuable point, that idea of palm oil had been covered. There'd been massive coverage. I had turned down, I think, 2 or 3 earlier projects involving palm oil because they were all offshoots of the environmental story, which is a terrible story and deserves continued coverage, but they didn't feel like they had kind of enough of a leap. And I think, again, what you guys did was you looked at this subject area that had a lot of coverage and said, what hasn't been covered? What's new and what's different, where we can actually bring, our reporting skills to uncover a new area.
Right. A lot of reporting is not new, right? A lot of the topics that we write about is not new, but based on the, when Margie and Robin, I was not at the AP when they did the seafood from slaves, but when they described it to me, we use, at least I use it a lot. And when we talk about doing a project, especially something that's been done before, the first thing I tell people is find the eye.
Oops, I've just lost Ron. All right, can you all still hear Ron?
No.
No.
Ron is frozen.
Yeah, I think I've just lost Ron, sorry. So, again, as you said, like kind of looking beyond what's already been done. This is an interesting question in a bit of a different direction. I'm going to say it's 7 o'clock now. We're scheduled to stop now, but we've got a few more questions. So we'll get through a few more questions. But obviously, if anybody needs to leave, it is 7 o'clock now. So the question is, have you ever questioned whether you're the right person to tell a story? And if so, how did you resolve that? Has that been an issue in your reporting?
Not really. Not really. I'm sure there are examples of when that might be something that, I guess you can say that for Maya and Burrell in a way. I did not, I lived in Minnesota was in Minnesota during that time. So a lot of that reporting was, covering the African-American community. And I think if I had been African-American, I would have gotten to it faster. I would have understood faster everything that led to his conviction. Because it wasn't just him, it's been happening in his neighborhood and the North and South Minneapolis for decades. And it took me a while to really believe everything I was hearing. Mm-hmm. And it might be the same thing with, covering, say, genocide, the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian genocide, the genocide in Cambodia. If I'll just speak for myself, if I were Cambodian, I was living there during that time. And I was living there 20 years later. I'm just thinking the reporters that were foreigners who didn't believe the stories that were coming out of the camps, because they just seemed too horrific. So it probably would have come out faster if there were good Cambodian reporters able to cover it. You know what I mean? It just gets you in quicker, and there's a greater, deeper understanding that we all can reach, but it takes a lot longer, I think.
Yeah. Margie, do you want to add anything to that or answer that question for yourself?
I'll just say that, having been a foreign correspondent for so many years, you're always the outsider. And we've said, so many times that, we often kind of see people parachuting in and doing stories and, getting all of this attention, and maybe it's a really good story, but maybe it's not, it's not quite right. or it's off. And we always felt like, you know, we don't really understand. This government is so complicated. I mean, we don't even understand what's going on with our own government. Like, you know, the history and all of the, you know, wars and, you know, they're just depending on where trauma. And oftentimes, you know, we are the ones who have to go parachuting in to a breaking story or, you know, whatever. And so it's always, you know, you do the very best that you can, but you're never going to know. You're not from there. You know, you're never really going to understand it in the way, like Robin said, you know, if you're Cambodian and you survive the genocide.
Yeah. Here's another earlier question. When consumers read these stories, they can sometimes think the problem will just go away if they just stop buying Girl Scout cookies or whatever product. How do you make sure readers don't come away with an overly simplistic takeaway, but know how complex the problem is? That kind of gets back to what you were saying earlier of wanting to have these different layers of the story, the banks, the brands, not just the story of the workers on the ground. Maybe if you can talk a little more about it in that context of why it was so important to build those different layers into the story.
I think, Marge, if you want me to take this, I think we tried to get that through the stories because it is such, as palm oil especially, it's so complicated. You cannot avoid it. But the same would be true with fish in the seafood story. You can't, the consumer is only going to have, you know, a certain amount of impact. It raises awareness. Definitely if you tell stores, well, I don't like, you know, I don't want to get fish from whatever, that the stores might have more power than the consumer. But ultimately it's going to come in the case, but it's going to come down to the government, which could also have to do with pressuring your lawmakers or just raising awareness. Or in the case of palm oil, because it is in so many products, we really felt that the only thing that could really influence change was the banks, the big financial institutions that are bankrolling this and basically contributing or to money laundering, or however you want to look at it from a you know, financial standpoint. This could get them into trouble. You know, if they don't know what's being deducted from people's wages, or if they're not being, and they're financing it, it actually could impact them. So, you know, consumer still has an important role to play. They can talk to their banks, their financial institutions, all the people, their you know, funds that are going into it, and they can pressure the companies, the governments. But I think just not buying it it's really hard to get the change that people want just by boycotting.
To create that kind of pressure. Yeah. Can you actually, we didn't really talk much about that part of the reporting, which is a very different type of reporting than the sort of on the ground in the plantations. You were able to outline a number of the banks that have been the real financiers and tie that back, you know, and ties to some of the brand stuff, but the banks in particular. Was that, how did you go about doing that reporting? Was that difficult? I don't know whether it was publicly available documentation. Was there much FOIAs or things that you were doing for some of more the data side? Talk about that piece of the reporting briefly, if you could.
Well, that was there was a group that had been looking at this particular issue, and a really well-respected organization that had done a lot of the legwork that we used to build on top. We basically built off their original work. So we knew what financial institutions were financing specific companies, and then, you know, years ago, and then we used that to kind of, you know, Reuters terminal, Bloomer terminal, financial experts who have been looking at these issues and confirm that it's still going on, how much, you know, how it was a really complicated part of the story, because it's not like you have a portfolio just for palm oil.
Mhm.
Often it's a company that has palm oil companies in it, or, so it was a lot of like checking and cross-checking, and then confirming with sources, and then of course going to the financial institutions themselves and confronting them before the stories came out.
And also looking at, specific banks in Southeast Asia that were
Mhm.
major, very much kind of intertwined with the palm oil industry, and seeing
Mhm.
what major, US and international banks were kind of, feeding into those banks.
Mhm. Okay. I think that's, if anybody else has a last question, I see one more that I think that we haven't gotten to. So if anybody else has a last question, feel free to put that in now. But it was somebody who wanted to go back a little bit to the question of how you cultivate sources. And if you could give any more detail about kind of how you found the people in the first place. And I think is interesting is how did you know who to try to turn into a source and help you organize getting on the plantation? Were there people who you started to talk to, you thought, maybe it's not such a good idea to talk to them? How do you know, the trust, we talked earlier about you need to build trust with them, but you also have to have trust that, you can trust the people you're dealing with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think, after you've been doing this for a while, you just kind of get a sense. I think when you and I like to, and it was really important, we do a lot of stuff obviously now with the pandemic and Zoom, but I mean, when you're in Southeast Asia, like face-to-face meetings are really important. And that's another reason why this took so long, is because, I was constantly going and having sit-down meetings with people. And, during the course of those meetings, you kind of figure out, okay, first of all, does this person actually know what's going on? Do they know what they're talking about? How willing are they? Do they seem like they're eager to help? What ideas do they have? How much do they, what areas are they knowledgeable about? So, I mean, we were dealing with like enormous swaths. I mean, Indonesia is a huge country. And so, we were talking to, like NGOs, we were talking to a lot of local, like I think people tend to, especially, like foreign correspondents, it's just easier to phone up somebody with some international organization, but they're not necessarily the ones on the ground. So like the bulk of the major, like I would say the kind of core sources that I trusted most, all of those were all Indonesians, Malaysians, all of them pretty much. But we also had like, Rainforest Action Network, from the very beginning, they had looked at this and they have some really great people who are really well sourced. And so they kind of, right off the bat, were able to kind of talk to us and give us some, ideas and some guidance and some information about like sources and things. But you really just, I don't know, it's like a gut feeling. You just kind of know. And you're not always right, but most of the time, I think we as reporters kind of know, like, okay, this person's going to be good.
I think it's usually the bigger surprise, or the bigger obstacle is it might be a really great source on the ground, helping, doing a million things, and then he's blasting things out on WhatsApp groups, or, announcing that you're working on something. And it's more that kind of loose cannon thing that you can't really know until it happens.
And then you have to like kind of go and very like
diplomatically kind of
say, can you like take that stuff down from Facebook and stop blasting the stuff out on WhatsApp to like 300 people, like pictures of us standing together, like, hey, we're investigating like abuses on this palm oil plantation.
Yeah,
like we're being so careful, and then sometimes the sources are not so careful.
Yeah,
Excited.
not quite what you want to have happen. Yeah. Okay. One last question I'd love for you each to all take, and then this has been great. Is there anything, so again, there's lots of students and recent grads on this. Is there anything you think of, like when you were first starting out as in doing investigative work, that you kind of know now that, you know, it's that classic, what would you tell your younger self? Is there, you know, any one bit of advice you'd give to your younger self, knowing what you know now about doing these kinds of stories?
Develop a thick skin.
Good.
That's a good, that's very true, I think.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Never let anybody tell you no. If you want to do it, do it. We've had people tell us no so many times. And some of those people who told us no, we have outlasted them and done the story when they have left the AP. And that is no lie. One story, it took us 10 years to do it.
Oh gosh.
And the person that told us no left, and we were like, okay, we're doing it. And we did it. And it was a great story.
What story was that? I don't know what story that is. I want to look it
Oh,
up.
it was a story about liver flukes in Vietnam veterans. Basically like them getting this really rare type of bile duct cancer after ingesting raw fish. And we put the story out on Veterans Day. And it was this like, you know, I mean, it got a lot of attention.
Well, it was one of those things that it didn't kill them until 50 years later, pretty much. So it was this, and they were fighting the VA. And
Yeah.
but I think mine is, I think big. No idea is too big. I think it took us a while to kind of realize that the bigger you go, the better the story is going to be, even if you only get 50% of it.
Yeah.
I think when I was younger, I used to kind of do more the spot stories and then do a little investigative element to it, but not really think, wait, how can this be a bigger story? It's not about this one topic or group or village or.
Yeah, but what's the
issue.
broader context and
Yeah.
what else is there? Oh, that's okay. That's great. Well, those were all great last bits, but this has been really a great conversation. So I just again want to thank you all for doing this, taking the time to share your thoughts with us. And you know, I'm sure I speak for everybody else. We can't wait to see what your next stories are. I'm sure you got something good cooking, so we'll keep an eye out for it. So again, thank you very much for doing this, and thanks everybody for joining us. And I think that's it.
Thanks
Thanks
you.
so much.